Montana Territory, early spring of 1879. Snow still clung to the north slopes of the Tobacco Root Mountains, and the chill in the air bit harder than the look in her brother's eyes when he said, "You ain't got a choice, Hattie. This is the only way." Harriet Hattie Ames stood barefoot in the dirt outside her family's weather-worn cabin, arms wrapped tight over her ribs. She was 20, all bones and bruises after the long winter, and her brother's handprint still colored her jaw. Across from her sat a rancher on horseback, a thick man with a red beard and a gut that strained his vest. He didn't ask her name. He just tossed a coin pouch to her brother and said, "She better cook and clean better than the last one." Hattie's lips parted, but nothing came out. Her brother, Wade, caught the pouch midair and didn't look back at her. "You'll be fed and clothed," he muttered. "Better than I can do anymore." Then the rancher reached down, grabbed her by the arm, and hauled her toward his horse. That was when the other man spoke. "I'll pay twice what he just gave you," came the voice, calm and low, like a thundercloud too far to hear but close enough to fear. Hattie twisted in the rancher's grip. A tall cowboy sat atop a dark sorrel gelding, his hat low over his brow, eyes shadowed but locked on her face. He wore a trail-worn coat and dust-covered boots, and there was nothing sloppy about the way he held the reins. His horse stood still, like it knew this man did not bluff. The rancher barked out a laugh. "She ain't your concern." The cowboy didn't flinch. "She is now." Wade stepped forward, face pinched. "Look." Mr. the cowboy's hand dipped into his coat, and he pulled free a leather pouch. He tossed it to Wade. "Count it." Wade caught it, opened it, and his eyes went wide. "That's too much." "I know," said the cowboy, "but it gets your hand off her arm, and it sends you back inside without another word." The rancher let go. Hattie stumbled, then caught herself. She stared at the stranger, heart pounding. He looked at her, then dismounted and held out his hand. "You are free. You can walk away, or you can come with me. I will not touch you. I will not expect anything. But I will not leave you here." She stared at his outstretched hand. Her knees shook. Wade was already retreating into the cabin, coins clinking. "What's your name?" she asked, voice hoarse. "Declan Shaw," he said. She took his hand. They rode for 2 days through the Gallatin Valley, where the rivers were swollen with snowmelt and elk trotted across the ridges. Declan did not talk much, but when he stopped to build a fire, he offered her the first bite, the warmest blanket, and his own water skin when hers ran dry. He never looked at her too long, never asked about what had happened. On the 3rd morning, she finally asked, "Why did you pay for me?" He looked up from where he was brewing coffee over the flames. "Because no one else did." She stared into the fire, eyes burning. That night they reached his homestead. It was tucked into a wide bend of the Madison River, rough-hewn log cabin, 2 corrals, a barn, and wide open land edged by cottonwoods dusted with snow. "It is not much," he said, tying off his horse, "but it is safe." She followed him off her mount, stiff-legged and silent. Inside, the cabin was clean. A fire already burned in the hearth. There were books on a shelf, and a quilt folded carefully over the back of a chair. "This is your space," he said, pointing to the smaller room. "You can lock the door if you want." She nodded, throat tight. Before she stepped inside, she looked back at him. "You really are not expecting anything?" He shook his head. "I just wanted you to be free." Days passed. She helped feed the horses, fetched water, mended a worn shirt of his when he left it on the chair. He never commented, only left it folded on her cot the next morning with a thank you note scratched in pencil. When he worked the fence line, she watched him. He moved with quiet focus, sleeves rolled, voice low when he greeted the horses. There were scars on his hands, and a sadness in the way he looked at the mountains, like he had lost something he still searched for. One night, after supper, she found him on the porch. The stars were out, and the river whispered through the cottonwoods. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, sitting beside him. He glanced over. "Regret paying for you?" She nodded. "No," he said. "I have not regretted a single thing." She looked down at her hands, turning them over in her lap. "I do not know what to do now. I do not know who I am anymore." "You are someone who survived," he said. "And now you get to choose." She looked at him. "And what did you choose?" He looked back at her, eyes soft. "Peace. And maybe, if I am lucky, someone to share it with." The air between them shifted. Warm. Heavy. She stood. "Good night, Declan." As she stepped inside, she felt his eyes on her back. And for the first time in years, she smiled. The wind shifted in April. It came down from the high ridges with the scent of thawed soil, and the cottonwoods near the river began to bud, pale green against gray bark. Hattie woke to birdsong one morning and lay still beneath the quilt, listening, unsure when the cold had finally let go. Declan was already outside when she stepped from the cabin. He was patching the front gate, shoulders hunched against the wind. She watched him for a moment before crossing the yard, her boots sinking into the softening ground. "You always fix everything yourself?" she asked, brushing her hair back. His hands didn't slow. "If I don't, it won't get fixed." She crouched beside him and reached for a spare nail. "Show me." He looked at her, and something passed between them, quiet understanding, maybe, or just the plain fact of wanting to be useful. He passed her the hammer without speaking. By midday, the gate swung smooth on its hinges. She leaned against the post, wiping sweat onto her sleeve, and he handed her a tin cup filled with rainwater. "There's a market in Virginia City next week," he said. "I need more salt and a new bridle strap. You could come along if you want." She hesitated, the rim of the cup resting just below her lip. "What would I do there?" "Whatever you like. Look around. See something different. I haven't seen a town in over a year." He didn't press, just waited while she thought. "I'll come," she said. "If it's all right." "It's all right." They rode out at dawn 3 days later. The trail wound along the edge of the river, then cut across open grassland where antelope lifted their heads at the sound of hooves. Declan stayed beside her, not leading, not following, just there. She didn't speak much, but it didn't feel like silence anymore. Felt like something shared. The town was louder than she remembered, wagon wheels on packed dirt, shouts from the livery yard, the clang of metal from the smithy. Men spat tobacco and called to each other across the street, and women stepped quick with baskets on their arms and their mouths set hard. She stayed close to Declan as they moved between stalls. He bought the bridle strap and a sack of oats, then turned to her. "Need anything?" She thought of the thin comb she'd used for years, the one with missing teeth, and the frayed hem of her only second dress. "A needle and some strong thread," she said at last. He nodded once and led her to a dry goods store. Inside, while she browsed, he stood near the door with his arms folded, watching the street. She picked out what she needed, then hesitated near a small wooden box filled with hairpins and ribbons. "You can have both," he said without turning. "I didn't say anything." "You don't need to." She chose a blue ribbon. They ate supper at a boarding house where the cook served beef stew and cornbread. Declan paid without comment, and when they sat down at the end of the long table, Hattie noticed the way his shoulders stayed tense, like he wasn't used to being surrounded. She didn't ask about it. She just passed him the salt without being told. On the ride back, dusk fell slow and soft across the valley. She let her horse pick its way through the sage, her fingers brushing the blue ribbon she'd tied at her wrist. "You were quiet in town," she said after a while. I prefer quiet. Is that why you live out here alone? He was silent so long she thought he might not answer. Then I was married. Long time ago. She looked over. His eyes were on the trail ahead. She passed. He nodded. Fever. Lost the baby too. The wind stirred between them. She didn't say sorry. He hadn't asked for that. After a moment, she said, I never thought I'd get out. I know. She glanced at him. And you think it's enough? Just this? Land and quiet and no one else. I did, he said. Before. Before what? He met her eyes. Before I saw you standing there, barefoot, not begging, not crying, just waiting for someone to choose different. She looked away, her throat tight. When they reached the homestead, the sky was copper with the last of the sun. They unsaddled in silence, the horses blowing warm breath into the dark. Inside, she paused by the hearth while he lit the lantern. I want to stay, she said finally. He looked at her. You already are. No, I mean really, not just passing through. He stepped closer, the lantern glow catching the lines at the corners of his mouth, the long ache in his eyes. I won't keep you, he said. She reached for his hand. I know. His fingers curled around hers, careful and steady. And in the hush that followed, something settled in her chest, not safety. Not yet, but the beginning of it. By early May, the river had turned loud with meltwater, and the grass behind the barn stood calf-high and thick with wild mustard. The days came longer now, and with them, a rhythm chores in the morning, fence checks after midday, quiet work in the evenings as the light stretched late across the valley. Hattie found herself learning again, though no one called it that. Declan never offered instruction unless she asked. He handed her a rasp one afternoon and simply said, If you want to try trimming hooves, I'll hold him steady. She crouched beside the gelding, tongue caught between her teeth, and made a clean cut along the edge of the hoof. He didn't correct her. When she straightened, dust clinging to her sleeves, he only said, Good. They didn't speak of what she'd left behind. But something had shifted since the ride back from Virginia City, less distance. More glances held a beat longer than before. She caught herself watching the way he rolled his sleeves just once before setting to work. The way he always checked the gate chain with his thumb even when he'd already latched it. He noticed, too. She could tell by the way he paused sometimes, like he was listening for something that hadn't been said aloud yet. One evening, as the wind settled and the sky turned copper blue, she came across him behind the barn, tying a rope halter with slow, practiced loops. Did you live here before your wife passed? She asked, stepping into the shade beside him. No, he said, knotting the rope. We had a place further east, near the mussel shell. What brought you here then? He tightened the last knot. Too many memories on that land. I needed new ones. She rested her hand against the barn wall. You ever think about leaving again? He looked at her, eyes steady. Not since you came. Her chest ached in a way that wasn't pain. She turned her gaze to the pasture, where a few cows grazed, tails flicking. I never thought I'd feel steady again, she said. Even now, I wake up expecting to be sent away. He stepped closer, rope tucked at his side. No one sends you from here. Her throat tightened. I wasn't raised to know what to do with kindness. Feels like I'll break it if I touch it wrong. You won't. He paused. It's not glass. It's something you build. She looked up at him. And if I don't know how, I'll show you. The quiet between them held, not heavy, but full. She didn't step back when his fingers brushed her wrist. He didn't push further. They stood like that until the sun dipped behind the ridge and the first stars came out. The next morning, he left before light to check on a neighbor's downed fence. She stayed behind, feeding the hens and carrying water from the creek. Inside, she found the small tin of coffee nearly empty and decided to walk the half-mile to the trapper's cabin where Declan traded now and then for supplies. The trapper, a stooped man called Ellery with a long beard and a limp from a bear trap mishap, greeted her with a grunt and a nod. "Don't see you alone too often," he said, scooping coffee into a cloth sack. "He finally trusts you not to burn the place down?" She smiled faintly. "I think he figured out I can stack firewood straighter than he can." Ellery let out a sound that might have been a chuckle. "He's different since you came. Don't talk so sharp. Don't drink quite so much." "I didn't know he drank." "Used to. Not to ruin himself, just enough to sleep." He handed her the sack. "Not my business, but you're good for that man." She paused at the door. "I've never been good for anyone, but I want to be." Ellery scratched at his beard. "Wanting's half the work." By the time she returned, the sun had climbed high. Declan's horse stood in the yard, lathered at the flanks. She hurried inside and found him at the wash basin, shirt off, a long red scrape down his shoulder. "What happened?" she asked, crossing to him. "Fence post snapped when I leaned against it. Took the wire with it." She reached for the cloth, dipped it in cool water, and pressed it to his back without hesitation. He made no sound, just sat still on the stool, letting her clean the wound. "You need stitches," she said. "There's thread in the drawer." Her hands shook a little as she threaded the needle. He didn't flinch when it pierced his skin, just kept his eyes on the floor. "You're not the first person I've sewn up," she said, voice low. "I'm guessing I'm the first who thanked you." "You are." She tied off the last stitch and sat back. "You need to rest." He turned his head. "Will you sit with me a while?" "Yes," she said. That night, she slept in the chair by his bed, her hand resting lightly on his. When the fire burned low, and the wind rattled the shutters, he stirred once and whispered, "You feel like home." She didn't answer, not with words. She only held his hand tighter. By mid-June, the hills behind the homestead turned soft with lupin and early paintbrush, and the river slipped quieter between its banks. The last of the late frosts had passed, and the air held the weight of heat that would stay through August. Hattie stood in the vegetable plot behind the cabin, sleeves rolled, palms pressed with soil. Her fingers had learned the rhythm of planting 2 seeds per hollow, just deep enough to keep them from the birds. She didn't hum as she worked, but something in her moved like she could have. Declan's footsteps came slow across the path. She didn't look up, only said, "You're late back." "Had to help a neighbor drive a stray calf out of the creek. Took longer than I thought." She brushed her hands clean on her apron and turned toward him. His shirt was damp at the collar, sun catching in the lines around his eyes. He handed her a folded piece of parchment. "Came in on the supply wagon. It's for you." She studied the handwriting. "It's Wade's." "I figured," he said. "You don't have to open it." She did anyway. The letter was brief, written in a tight, slanted scrawl. He asked after her health, mentioned he'd traded the coin for a mule and a winter's worth of flour. He didn't offer apology. There was no request for her to return. Just a single line at the end, hope the man turned out decent. She folded the paper once and tucked it into her apron pocket. "He wants to think he gave me something better." Declan didn't answer. He stepped back and looked toward the ridge. "I was thinking about fencing the upper pasture," he said. "It's got better grass than the south run. Would give the horses room. Need help measuring it? I'd welcome it." They walked the rise together, past wind-scrubbed pine and rock outcroppings still cool in the shadow. When they reached the crest, she paused and looked out. The valley stretched wide below green and gold, with swaths of aspen along the riverbend. From up high, the cabin looked smaller than she remembered. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. "Not once," he said. Not since I put a roof over it. She crouched to run her hand along the grass, measuring the slope with her palm. I never thought I'd want to stay anywhere again. He looked down at her. You could have left any time. I know, she said, but I didn't want to. They marked the perimeter together, laying out stones where fence posts would go. When they stopped to rest, she sat with her back against a pine, legs stretched, arms dusted in pollen. Declan sat beside her, knees drawn up. When I first came here, I didn't talk to anyone for 3 months. Didn't light the lamp some nights. I thought if I kept still enough, the grief would pass by. She didn't speak, only waited. I was wrong, he said. It didn't pass. I just got used to the weight of it. He turned toward her. But the weight's been different lately. She looked at him fully. Lighter. No, he said. Real. Like something I can carry and not lose myself in. She reached across the space between them and laid her fingers over his. I've never had anything that felt like it could belong to me, she said quietly. But I think this might. He didn't move to kiss her. He didn't speak. But his hand turned beneath hers and held on. That night, back at the cabin, she washed the dust from her arms and braided her hair by the dim light of the lantern. Declan sat near the hearth, turning pages of a worn almanac, fingers idly tapping his knee. She stepped into the main room, braid resting over one shoulder. Would it be all right if I stayed in here tonight? He looked up slowly. You don't have to ask. I want to, she said, because I'm choosing it. He stood and crossed the room. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows along the floor. I'll make more room, he said, gesturing to the bed. We'll figure it out, she answered. They didn't rush. There was no hunger in it. Only a long, quiet unfolding like the thaw after a long storm, slow and sure. When she woke beside him, her cheek on his shoulder, she didn't startle. She didn't brace herself. Outside, the first light of dawn slipped through the shutters, catching the edges of the quilt she'd stitched herself, the thread still faint where it looped through the corner. She turned toward him, her voice soft. Do you still feel like you're carrying it? He reached for her hand beneath the covers. No. Not anymore. And for the first time, she believed the past could stay behind her, and the life ahead could be one they built together, measured not in what they'd lost, but in what they chose to keep. By early July, the sun held longer in the sky, laying its gold over the hills until well after supper. The pasture fence stood straight and solid now, each post tamped into earth Hattie had helped dig herself. The land bore signs of them, both her stitching on the quilts, his handwriting on the tool ledger, their shared footprints worn into the porch boards. That morning, Declan rose before her. She heard him moving about quietly, the kettle lifted from the hook, coals stirred in the hearth. She stayed in bed a few minutes longer, watching how the light stretched across the floorboards like it was reaching for something soft. When she stepped into the kitchen, he had already poured 2 cups and was setting out a small paper parcel. She raised an eyebrow. That from the last supply run? He nodded and unwrapped it to reveal a tin of dried peaches. Neighbor owed me for the lumber I lent. I told him you'd put it to better use than he would. She smiled and bit into one, the tartness chasing sleep from her tongue. I'll make a pie after we bring in the firewood. He shook his head. Not today. I want to show you something. They rode out late morning, the wagon creaking under the weight of blankets and a small basket she packed without asking what for. He led them west, into a fold of the land she hadn't seen before, where the trees grew dense and the air cooled with pine and shade. When they stopped, the clearing opened before them, ringed by wild rose and soft with needles underfoot. A narrow stream trickled through the far end, clear and cold. She blinked. How long have you known about this place? Since the first week I got here, he said, unhitching the horse. Never brought anyone before. She laid out the old quilt and sat cross-legged. Not even when you needed the quiet? He crouched beside her, thoughtful. Back then, quiet didn't feel like rest. Felt like drowning. She reached for his hand, thumb brushing the calloused edge of his palm. And now it feels like you. They ate bread and cured meat, the peaches saved for last, sticky on their fingers. Afterward, she lay back, watching the clouds drift slow overhead. He rested beside her, one hand under his head, the other brushing the hem of her skirt where it drifted against the grass. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked. "I do." She turned to look at him. "Tell me." He propped himself on one elbow. "I'd like to expand the barn. Maybe add a lean-to for tools. Plant some fruit trees near the creek if the bears don't get to them first." She smiled. "That's not what I meant." "I know," he said, "but I figured if I started there, the rest might follow." She waited. "I've been thinking about asking you to marry me," he said, voice even. "Not because I think I have to, but because I want to build something with you that has a name." Her throat caught. "And what if I say yes? Then I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you never doubt it." She sat up, knees tucked close. "I want it. I want the name. I want the land and the trees and your voice at the end of every day." He reached into his coat and pulled out a narrow band of silver, worn smooth at the edges. "My mother's," he said. "She gave it to my father when she had nothing else to give." He slipped it onto her finger, and it fit like it had always been meant for her. They married the following Sunday, beneath the cottonwoods near the river. The preacher arrived on horseback, dust in his beard and a Bible worn at the edges. Ellery came too, and 2 ranching families from upriver. Nothing was fancy, just bread, stew, and laughter under a sky that held no threat of storm. Declan wore a clean shirt and boots she'd scrubbed herself. She wore her blue ribbon and a dress she'd sewn from the last bolt of calico in town. When the vows were said, and his hands found hers with the steadiness she'd come to trust, the quiet that filled her chest was not fear. It was peace. That night, they walked the edge of the pasture, fingers laced. Fireflies flickered near the fence line, and the warmth of the day still clung to the earth. "I used to count the days," she said, "just to get through them." He brought her hand to his lips. "And now, I forget to count. They don't feel like something to survive anymore. They feel like something to keep." They built the lean-to by August, and the fruit trees took root the following spring. She kept the ring on always, except when kneading bread or dipping her hands in the wash basin. He read aloud to her some evenings, the light soft on their porch, her mending in her lap. Together, they planted rows of vegetables, raised 2 colts, and weathered 4 winters with salt and wood stacked high. They never spoke much of the past. It stayed there, behind them, like the last frost of a hard season. What mattered was the land, the quiet, and the hands that never let go. And so they lived not just beside one another, but with each other. Fully, deeply, without fear. There was no more waiting to be chosen. They had already chosen each other. Forever.